Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. This conversation is with Phil Windley, one of the best thinkers in digital identity. Phil has had a variety of roles in public and private companies, in government, in the military, and in education. He was actually the CIO for the state of Utah for about 2 years. Also, if you've ever attended an internet identity workshop, well, Phil is one of the co-founders of it. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Phil, which we called Musings on digital wallets and identity metasystems. So throughout the conversation, we cover self-sovereign identity wallets, talk a little bit about what can be learned from web browsers, and then looking forward and thinking about how the adoption of SSI wallets is going to happen. In the digital identity space, it's very easy for us to think about things as layers or foundations rather than in a decentralized architecture way, and I must admit it happens to me at times. In regulated environments, rather than thinking of governments issuing digital IDs as being something foundational, how could we look at a particular government agency as being one identity system and being one participant on a sphere of the identity metasystem rather than a layer? And so if we distinguish identity systems from identity metasystem, it makes the conversation about roles and perhaps certifications or trust marks much easier. So I really enjoyed that part of the conversation with Phil. So thank you to all of you who are listening today. You make this very motivating and a lot of fun to continue doing, and I look forward to continuing this into 2022. So thank you. And so now without any further ado, here's my conversation with Phil Windley. Enjoy. One of the things that I'm wondering if you could kind of compare SSI wallets or digital wallets that hold credentials to, is the web browser. And I'm wondering, in your perspective, what could we possibly learn from how the web browser started and ended up that could possibly be learnings that could be applied to the wallets, and maybe what are some of the differences? How do you kind of compare those two together?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways we could go with that. I think one of the most interesting things about the web, and it was probably accidental, was this idea that you had a client, a browser that, for the most part, because it was, working with a protocol, HTTP in this sense, and HTML and URLs, right? Those three things together, that didn't really matter which browser you used. They were all kind of the same, right? They felt the same. They had a back button. Some of that, I think, was planned. Some of it was just, like I say, accidental, where, one thing looked like it worked, and so everybody just kind of kept that thing. But that idea of a consistent user experience, I think, was really important to the early web, because it was amazing, I think, when people got on the web and figured things out, right? I'm old enough to remember when nobody really knew what to do. I remember seeing the very first URL on TV. It was for a TV ad for IBM. And they had IBM.com on it. And I thought, wow, somebody put a URL on TV. But once people figured that out, they knew, okay, I just, go to Yahoo, or I put in this URL, and then I can go to all these different places with this one application. I mean, I don't know if anybody used that word back then, but that's what we'd call it now, right? And websites were simple, text, pictures, links, that kind of thing. You clicked, you backed, and that consistent user experience, I think, had a lot to do with people picking up and using the web and being comfortable with how it worked. Not too many years later, a decade later, Kim Cameron talked about the importance in his Laws of Identity. He talked about the importance of consistent user experience in identity systems. And, I think that's been a very different story. If you think about how identity, mostly authentication, works online, because there was really no accepted protocol. There was a protocol, right? There was user authentication for in HTTP, which was so ugly that nobody ever wanted to use it on their website. And so in that, everybody invented their own. I remember doing it back in the 90s. We needed accounts, and so we just invented ways for people to log in. And over the years that changed, and people had ideas, some of them good, some of them bad. And and so it's similar, right? If you go to almost any website, you kind of know that somewhere there's going to be a login form, maybe a button you have to click first, and it might be up in the upper right hand corner. That's kind of a thing we have now, that we think of it being up there, but it's always different, right? Is this site going to be using SMS for two-factor authentication, or don't they support two-factor authentication at all? Or are they going to require a CAPTCHA to prove I'm human, and how's that going to work? And it's all over the map in terms of how logging in, a seemingly simple exercise, how different it can be between websites. And so, I think that makes the job of logging in to the dozens of websites we visit every day, because now almost all of them require you to log in to do something interesting. It just makes it all that much more difficult. So I think, the thing that the browser gave us was this idea of a consistent user experience.
And it sounds at the same time that this consistent user experience wasn't something that was mandated, right? It just kind of happened that, okay, we're not going to screw with the back buttons, we're not going to screw with the refresh page or whatever.
I think it's a mixture, right? Because it's both. Some of it is mandated by how HTTP works and how links work, and that sort of thing, and URLs. I mean, there's a certain amount of structure there, but you're right. There are ways to break it, right? The most famous is websites that break the back button. And, that's one of the user experience faux pas that people have written about. And so that's just convention, right? We just teach people, don't break the back button, because it's not a good idea. So yeah, I think it's a mixture of both.
The other thing that I guess if you look at the landscape of browsers today is that there are many of them, right, that represent most of the methods that we use to access our 12 websites per day or stuff like that. I don't have numbers handy in front of me, but I'm sure browsers such as Chrome or Safari, or at one time Internet Explorer, or Brave nowadays, or whatever, you only have a handful of them as well.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a similar trajectory that we're going to see with wallets?
I'm fearful that it's not. Back in the 90s, the company I had, iMall, we had a investment from First Data Corporation, which at the time was the largest credit card processor in the US. I don't know what their status is now. So they had all of these partnerships with banks. And, this was back when the web was new and banks and everybody else wanted to figure out what they were going to do online. And there was an idea, now it doesn't sound like it was that good of an idea, but at the time there was an idea that banks might be commercial hubs, right? That they might be places where, people got on and had their storefronts and things. And so since that's what we did, we did a lot of meetings with banks to talk about how they could use the web as part of their business. And invariably, in every single meeting we had with a bank, they asked the question, but can you help us get our own browser? And it's understandable. They saw their brand inside this other brand and they didn't like it, right? They didn't. I mean, at the time it was, Mozilla, Netscape, those kinds of things. They didn't like their brand being framed by this other thing, and it was a big deal to them. And of course, we kind of laughed about it. Oh, haha, no, you can't get your own browser. No one will use it. Tried to help them understand why that was true. And it turns out that in 2007, Steve Jobs gave everybody their own browser by allowing them to create apps. Right? So now apps are essentially everybody having their own browser. And that's good and bad, right? It's great because there are some really cool apps, and you can do some things in apps that you couldn't do in a browser. However, there are a lot of apps that really are just fancy browsers that you could imagine it being a website. And because of that, now the user experience, even online, has fractured and fragmented more than it was before. A couple of weeks ago, my wife Lynn sent me a text and said, "How do I share this video with someone?" And 10 years ago, the answer would have been easy. I would have said, "Well, just copy the address in the address bar and send it to them with email or text or however you want to." But now I had to say, "Okay, what app are you using?" And then because I don't use that app all the time, I had to open it up and search for the share button. And, they're always in a different place, and say, "Oh, well, what you want to do is you want to click on the three dots in the lower right-hand corner. And then when that menu comes up, select this." And, my point is just that a simple thing like sharing is completely different in every single app that you have. Now, you would ask about wallets. So why did I go off on this tangent about apps and browsers? Well, wallets are apps. And I think the same tendency or the same desire that the banks had back in the 90s to want their own browser, and that companies have now to prefer their app to their website, which is another trend I think we're seeing, that companies are more and more favoring their app over their website, even to the point where their website becomes almost non-functional for many things. I think that same trend drives into SSI wallets, where everybody's going to want to put the SSI functionality inside their app. And I understand that. I get why people want to do that. And on one hand, that doesn't necessarily hurt the user experience that much, in the sense that the user experience for SSI, I believe, is based on two primary artifacts, and that is connections or relationships between entities, right? People to people, people to organizations, organizations to organizations, people to things. It doesn't really matter what they are, but you create a relationship using DIDs, although most people will never see DIDs, won't know what DIDs are, won't know that DIDs exist. They'll just think of it as, "Oh, I created a connection." And then once you've created a connection, either receiving or sharing information out of credentials. So those two primary artifacts, connections and credentials, drive the user experience inside the SSI wallet in the same way that things like URLs and HTML drove the user experience inside the web. So to that extent, if every bank wants to have their own SSI experience inside their app, and every vendor wants to do that, it'll still be about making a connection and getting and receiving credentials. And I think early on, there's nothing wrong with that, and because most credentials are going to be, in-house, as it were, right? I might issue credentials to my employees, for example, as a digital form of their employee badge or something like that. But what we don't get out of that is we don't get people thinking, "Oh, I've got a wallet and I control all of the things in this wallet, and I can use them in tandem with each other to accomplish some goal." Right? So this gets into a concept that I call digital embodiment. And I think that one of the big problems with the web to date is that people have largely not had any presence on it. They are always or almost always acting within the administrative system of some other entity, right? Every time we log in, we're essentially part of that administrative system and working inside that administrative system. So it's kind of like, you can think of your credentials as like a passport that gets you into Amazon or gets you into Yahoo. But once you're there, you have to operate within their rules and their terms and conditions. And of course, they can take that privilege away from you at any time. And so you don't really have any place to stand as an individual that is independent of these other administrative systems. And so I think that having the SSI experience fragmented between lots of different applications for every single entity we interact with perpetuates that idea that we are not embodied and able to act on our own for the things we want to accomplish. Practically speaking, what it means is that I can't use my bank credential and my employment credential together when I want to, say, apply for a mortgage at yet another company. And like I said, I think right now that's probably not a big use case, and so lots of people are ignoring it. But if we get to the point where everybody just has their SSI credentials in 100 different apps on their phone, I think we miss this kind of this idea that people have a wallet. It's almost like, imagine if every time you got a credit card or your driver's license or your voting card or whatever you got, they sent you a wallet to go with it, and you had to carry around their wallet for that credit card, and your other credit card had to go in that wallet, and you couldn't put them all in your own wallet. I mean, obviously, from a physical standpoint, that would be impractical because we don't really want to carry around 100 different things in our pockets. But and on a phone, it's easy, right? I just add another app. So from that perspective, it's not such a big deal. But it doesn't allow me to feel like I just have all of these things, they're mine and I control them. So, that maybe I'm rambling, but that's kind of the idea that I think is missing in this vision. If we don't give people SSI wallets that they can control and have all of their credentials in one place.
I could understand why companies have a preference for their customers to use apps rather than browsers. You could think about a whole lot of better engagement and personalization and notifications. And there's so much stuff to allow you to better know, let's say, your customer and who you're dealing with. You're always kind of with them, being in the pocket. I think the whole notification thing is genius, but scary at the same time. But then if you're saying, and I'm definitely seeing this trend as well, where, and like you said, it makes sense where if I'm bank ABC, I don't want the customer to leave my branding. I want them to be under what I'm doing. But then you're kind of moving away from a lot of the principles maybe of self-sovereignty, or I don't see how it is self-sovereign, or what's the difference anyways at that point. That, hey, I'll have my driver's license now in 5 different places because I have to have it there, but it's verifiable. So it's all good.
Yeah, you get some of the benefit, but not the self-sovereign part.
Do you think, and I guess the common business model of, and that's what I've always kind of struggled to see, just like the Pure Wallet app, is that you're not extracting data. You don't have the same ability to do stuff that you would do in other applications, and you have your advertising business models or whatever that business model is, collecting data on your customer to offer them, to upsell them more products and services, whatever that is. With the wallet, you don't really do that. So then it's like, what's the business model with the Pure Wallet? And then at the same time I feel that often we try to take stuff from the physical world and apply it to the digital world, and just try to translate it in the same way when maybe that's not kind of the start point that we should be going from? Is calling it a wallet maybe a misrepresentation or not helping what we're trying to do here?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we can carry the analogy too far, and I think calling it a wallet is probably limiting in terms of what we can actually do with these things, right? I mean, in reality, we call it a wallet, but if you get technical in the SSI world, there's really two things there. There's an agent and a wallet. And the wallet is really just the repository for keys and credentials and things like that. Whereas the agent is actually the software piece that is, doing things like getting a message that says, oh, this company wants to issue you a credential. Do you want to accept it? And oh, this company needs this information. Do you want to provide it? So that agent is actually the software piece that is providing that kind of interaction. And I think by calling it a wallet, we lose sight of the fact sometimes that it is much more capable or could be much more capable than merely a repository for credentials and connections, right? It's important to have a repository for those things, but the agent could do much more and can do much more. And I think, if we could go 10 years in the future, we'd see, people using agents in a much bigger way than what we see right now in the current SSI wallet space. So I mean, for now, I think it's a term that that translates well. People kind of understand what it means because they do understand wallets. But yeah, like any analogy to the physical world, software is so much more malleable and capable. You'd ask about the business model, and I don't think there is one, right? I think the business model for wallets is kind of the same as the business model for browsers. And early on, Netscape thought they were going to make a business out of selling browsers, and that didn't really turn out, right? And then they tried to sell servers. That didn't turn out either. So I think there's definitely a room for wallets, and I think you'll see a handful of them get created by companies who are really just enabling other things that they do, which is true of the wallet vendors right now. I think if you look at companies like Evernym or ID Ramp or Trinsic, I think you guys have a wallet, don't you, Northern Block? I mean, I don't think any of those companies look at the wallet as a business. I think they look at it as a piece of enabling software, and that's both good and bad, right? It's good because they're providing a service, and that's always nice. But it's bad because without a business model, people don't spend a lot of time on things. And so, a lot of the things you might see, a lot of the improvements you might see in wallets and agents, may be longer in coming because of that.
To your point, I think we at Northern Block never saw a business model with the wallets. It's just kind of a piece of infrastructure that you need to have to enable stuff to move forward right now, right? So you want to have that, and for whatever reason, that's the dangling carrot that people like to see, and then they get involved. They just like seeing wallets, and that gets them involved. Your other comment about kind of, and that's what we've struggled with, is that we never wanted to put the application live, even if it was a reference wallet, because what the hell are you going to do with it? And that's when then you look, okay, my bank wants to have a wallet in there. There's specific user journeys, there's specific stuff that I would go there. And just like every other consumer app that I use on my phone, they're all trying to suck as much time from me as possible. But with a general wallet, there's no model there, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've kind of always struggled with that one as well. And then also to see, like, if there's no demand for these general wallets and the banks don't want to use them, then I don't see how they're going to evolve too much. I know there are, and Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
Well, I was just gonna agree with you that I think that, if I were you guys, or Trinsic or ID Ramp or Evernym or anyone else who was in this space, and a customer came to me and said, "Hey, can you put a wallet inside our app?" I'd say yes. Right? It's business, right? And especially when you're a small business, that's how you survive. So I don't blame anybody for doing it, but I do think that there's some danger to the overall ecosystem in that trend.
Well, one of the things that's quite interesting, being that we're based up in Canada, there's a lot of activity from various Canadian provincial governments that are looking to issue digital identities to their citizens in the form of a verifiable credential. I think a lot of the questions that are still trying to be answered, this is not just in Canada, but everywhere, it's where do you draw the line in the sand if you're public sector, if you're private sector? And that's a bit of a difficult one to think about as well, when the public sector's role in this whole space seems to be just they're trying to offer a public utility to the population. They're trying to create economic opportunities, just like, and in a recent podcast with Tim Boma, I really liked the analogy, just to compare it to roads, right? Public roads, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to allow cars to go from point A to point B and create economic activity that way. That's kind of a nice way of looking at digital ID from a government perspective. In your opinion, where does kind of the government's role stop in this? Because I think a lot of questions that are being asked is like, do you need to offer trust marks to wallets? How do you make sure that certain vendors aren't, I don't know, creating fraud with your citizens and stuff like that? Where do you draw the line in the sand? And then on the other side, then it's like, well, if the private sector wants to consume these things, they should be able to consume these things anyways. So I'd be curious to pick your brain on kind of how you see that whole interaction between the public and private sector, because a lot of folks have a lot of questions of, where does that line sit?
I think it's important to distinguish between identity systems and identity metasystems when we talk about these. What I mean by that is, going back to a physical world analogy, governments issue driver's licenses, right? They do that for their own reasons. I was the CIO for the state of Utah for a couple of years, and the driver's license division insisted that they were not in the identity business. They didn't want to be in the identity business. What they were in the business of was licensing drivers, and they knew how to do that. They would, take your picture, they would ask you a bunch of questions, they'd give you a driver's test. I mean, whatever requirements they had, and they were free to make those up, right? And when I say they, I mean the state, right, was free to make those up and do whatever they wanted. Obviously they had to, there were certain international norms and other things they had to do. That's an identity system, right? Whether the driver's license division wants it to be an identity system or not, it turns out that it is. But it's not the meta system, right? The meta system is this idea that people can have cards that they carry around in wallets that have pictures on them for authentication, and that people will trust or not trust the data that's in that card, and that people hold them and they can present them at various places. And that idea means that my employer can do the same thing with their employee card, and somebody else can decide that they want to do it for a loyalty card. And Visa says, hey, wouldn't this be a great way to let people take their credit around from place to place? And now we've got credit cards. And so my point is, there's a meta system of cards and presentment, and why we trust some and don't trust others, and then there's a specific system, which is the driver's license. And the same thing exists in SSI. There is a meta system made up of the protocols that allow us to create connections and issue credentials and prove information out of those credentials. We were just talking about wallets. That's part of the Metasystem in the sense that they're based on standards that they have to be in order to function in this overall system. And because of that, especially general purpose wallets, they can make connections with anyone. And as long as the other party is following the conventions, and exchange credentials with anyone, as long as the conventions and protocols are being followed. So that's a Metasystem that just describes how connections are made and how credentials are exchanged. Now along comes a government, and the government says, well, we have a specific reason for issuing this card, whether it's a driver's card or a voter card or an identity card or a business license or whatever it happens to be. They have a specific reason, and that is a specific identity system within this entire ecosystem. Too often, I think, we conflate this idea of the Metasystem and the identity system and believe that somehow we have to have the government identity system as the foundation that underlies all other identity systems. And to a certain extent, that's understandable because we trust governments to do a good job of proofing people, and they clearly can mandate its use in certain areas. But that doesn't necessarily make the identity system, right? Just giving everybody a government ID doesn't make an identity system, because now when my employer says, "Oh, we need employee badges," government ID system does nothing for that, right? It's just they might use it to validate some information about me when they hire me, but it doesn't do anything from the employer's need for an identity system on their own. And I'm using identity system in a very general sense. I don't necessarily mean digital or analog. It could be either. And so, to your question about what is the government's role, I think the government's role can be multifold. In the system we just talked about, clearly they have a role of providing identity credentials for whatever purposes they deem necessary. And if those happen to be useful to the rest of us for other purposes, then the SSI Metasystem makes that possible, right? I can, just like I can use my physical driver's license to prove I'm over 21 when I go into a bar, I can use my verifiable credential-based driver's license to prove I'm over 21 when I go into the bar. So in the same way we use it in the physical world, we could use it in the digital world. But as far as other entities who want to build their own identity systems within this Metasystem, they may or may not care whether there's a government credential that they can rely on. And that is completely up to them. This is an issue with decentralized systems. Humans are really bad at thinking through how decentralized systems work. And so we always want to say, oh, there's this government, and we put it down at the foundation, and then we build everything on top of that. And in fact, that's not really how it works. Government just does its own thing for its own purposes. It turns out that sometimes that's useful in other contexts as well, and so we use it. So that's one view of what the government's role is. Just do whatever they normally do for their own purposes, and we'll figure out the rest. On the other hand, I think they can play a role because they are trusted entities. They can play a role in what systems they pick and what protocols they support. And whether that's an official trust mark from the government or an endorsement, I think is a different kind of question. But nevertheless, by choosing good systems and supporting good systems, and doing things that allow identity ecosystems to flourish, governments can play a huge role because, like I said, we trust them. Now, there's a third level, right, which is where governments exercise their monopoly on violence, to force people to do things, right? Whether that's pay taxes or use your government ID card when you, identify yourself for voting, or whatever they are doing, right? They make regulations, and they can certainly make regulations around identity systems. Although, I think that trying to imagine an overarching government regulation around digital identity is difficult. I don't think there's many who would argue that GDPR and CCPA have, probably caused as many problems as they solved. They almost always cement in a certain mindset or a certain view that then is difficult to dislodge. So I don't necessarily think there's a huge role for government regulation in the meta system at large, although there certainly can be in various contexts where governments have interest and want to do it. So those three levels, right? Just doing your own thing, endorsing good things, and then regulating or compulsing is that a word? Making compulsory the use of some things are three ways that governments can participate. And I think, I would like to see them do the first a lot. I would like to see them do the second a little. And I think they need to be very careful in the third thing, in the regulatory side of especially emerging technologies like SSI.
Even spending a lot of time talking about the centralized architectures and models, for some reason, the human mind just seems to get tied up with a different way of looking at things. So I really like your way of splitting it up between the identity systems and the meta system, which the meta system, it's a market-driven system. That it'll go wherever the market is at that point. So the government issuing credentials into a meta system, if they're on a sphere, they're just an entity on there that's injecting a supply into the meta system, and then folks could use it as they wish from there.
And if you look at the overall ecosystem of credentials, they certainly will be important, right? Because people have a lot of trust in them, and because they are compulsory in certain contexts. I did a back the envelope calculation a few years ago, just looking at the number of businesses in the US, and then I split them up. So this is just US. And I split them up into large, medium, and small, according to the SBA's, the Small Business Associate or Administration's guidelines for what they considered large, medium, and small. And then just kind of assigned, okay, I think a large business, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, a large business probably can have 20 credentials, and a medium business can probably have 5 credentials, and so on. And so my back the envelope calculation, I concluded that there were at least 16 million different credential types, not credentials, but credential types that you could imagine existing just in the US. So, and each of those credential types, you have to remember, is a separate identity system built for a specific identity purpose by a specific entity in a specific context. So when we talk about identity systems, we tend to think, oh, we're going to build one identity system and that's going to do it all. I mean, that's a common mistake that people new to identity to make all the time is, oh, if we just had this, government ID that tied to your physical person, then all of our problems would be solved. But think about 16 million different identity systems that people have need of just in the US. And now, spread that around the world, that number just multiplies. So, I think the number of identity systems, we lose track of the fact that identity systems are everywhere. And people build them every day for all kinds of purposes, most of them very small, right? Not very many people, in a very niche context. And it's kind of evolutionary where, the identity system evolves to match whatever niche it's in.
If we're looking at this as our our sphere, and you have the different entities, and the government of a particular state in the US or province in Canada could be injecting a supply of credentials. That's where behind that, on that second layer, they have their specific identity system that they run their administrative process or whatever they do to come up with that. And then they push that then into the ecosystem. And then if I have 16,000 bubbles around the sphere, each one of them has their own identity system behind it. That's what you're getting at.
Yeah, exactly.
That's super cool. And at the same time, it's just the same issue sometimes of applying just how things work in the physical world today to digital. You don't know how things are actually going to work as different foundational elements get built, and then there's new use cases, new opportunities, and stuff like that become possible. So it could become even more than that. And then that's maybe I'd be interested to hear from you. Kind of you talk maybe governments should be involved a little bit in endorsements. What does that little bit look like? Do you have some ideas there? And at the same time, if we don't know what we don't know, so we don't know what use cases will be possible, at the same time, probably want to be careful to not put too many boundaries that are going to impact any new innovation from happening.
Yeah. So on the endorsement, I mean, endorsement is maybe too specific a word, but let's use it for now. But I think about, for example, the province of British Columbia choosing to use Aries, Hyperledger Aries, for business registration and as the basis for many of the other identity systems that they're building, digital identity systems that they're building. That's an endorsement of sorts. I mean, it isn't like they, went out and put their, trust mark on it and, stamped it, but just the fact that they're there building things, participating, had a huge impact on how others saw Aries. And, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, for good or bad, we view governments as they have a lot of weight in their decisions. And so I think that kind of decision-making, careful decision-making about, what is it we want to accomplish, but also what is it we want to accelerate or to get people to think about, is an important role that governments can play. I mentioned I was the CIO for the state of Utah, and I think governments at all levels apply that endorsement potential in patches, right? Sometimes they do a good job of it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're very scared of it, right? Which keeps them from acting. I see a lot of, state governments in the US making choices about mobile driver's licenses, for example, that I disagree with, and I'm sure we could have a lively debate with the right people about, the pros and cons of certain choices. But, as an example, I think that choosing technologies which are proprietary or require that others get locked into certain proprietary, regimes is not a good look for government. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes governments don't think enough about what they're doing when they make those choices. So that's what I mean when I talk about endorsements, is really just those kind of choices that governments make with purchasing decisions. They're outsized entities often in their purchasing. And so they can have a huge impact on how things happen, based just on what they decide to buy or what they decide to do.
Being fortunate enough to see what's happening in Canada with various provinces, there is a big push for open source and not being locked down to any specific vendor. But then you come back to one of our earlier points in the conversation when we're talking about browsers have become apps, but if I go upstream more than that, I'm sitting on the operating system at this point, which is, am I not just locked in anyways at the operating system level?
Well, yeah, that's a tough topic, right? Because they're really, from a mobile standpoint, which is where a lot of people will want to use SSI because they'll want to use it when they're out and about. There really are only two that matter, right? Android and Apple. and they can make decisions that are, detrimental to how all of this plays out. I mean, they certainly have proprietary interests. Apple's made decisions that, I think could hurt SSI. I don't see them doing something like banning wallets to hold credentials or something like that. But, they certainly do play this outsized role. My hope through the last 5 years as we've been working on SSI is just that, Google and Apple and Facebook and others would just ignore us long enough that that something could get started. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good answer to the OS vendor problem. It's definitely something that concerns me. I think ultimately the only real answer is to get serious about breaking up monopolies, and doing that in a way that says, okay, if you want to be the OS vendor, that's fine, but you can't have an interest in the apps that run on it. Or, and clearly we haven't been willing to make that decision for 30 years. So I'm not confident or hopeful that it's going to happen anytime soon. But those are the kind of decisions we could make that would have an impact on these problems.
Then I guess do you let the market just drive itself and make these decisions? Or again, do you say the government's role will be to do this, but perhaps the ability to break up back in the day, a GE type of company is not so simple anymore with an Apple type of company that has the data on everyone in the world and could exert that power.
I think it's really hard.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, just you've seen some standards and some approaches that you maybe didn't agree with or don't agree with as much as using DIDs or verifiable credentials and the standards that come with that. I'm seeing a lot of activity, and I'm obviously deep in the SSI space, but seeing a lot of activity still with MDLs, with DTCs, a lot of activity in the OpenID community as well. Seems like everyone is, and maybe it's a confusion again around kind of you're separating the identity system and the meta system thing, but what's your perspective on the whole space? Because it seems like there's a lot of different approaches and philosophies, and it's probably driven by existing business models that folks have. But what is the outcome here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I've been really heartened actually that to see the OpenID Connect SIOP work. SIOP is the self-issued identity provider, or OpenID provider. Maybe that's what the O is. I'm not sure. But anyway, I've watched this and participated some over the last 16, 17 years. When we first started IIW, Internet Identity Workshop, back in 2005, the primary topic of the workshop was user-centric identity. And I think at the time we all believed that URL-based identity, which was the original OpenID, right? Or information cards, which was a credential-like system that Kim Cameron at Microsoft had proposed. I thought we thought one of those was going to be the way that this all worked. It didn't turn out. OAuth came along, UMA, others have come along, and the trend was that OpenID in particular was mostly. It started off as just anybody can have a URL and have your identity. It became there's just a few, real OpenID providers. This was known as the NASCAR problem, right? Because when you go to a website and you want to log in, how many logos can you list there for the various choices people have to log in, right? And eventually it kind of came down to, well, now there's just 2 or 3 that people list. And as long as you've got one of those, you're good, right? Log in with Google, log in with Apple, log in with Facebook. I mean, those are kind of the standard choices. So I think the self-issued identity provider work is really cool because it's kind of taking OpenID back to its roots. And people who are deep into OpenID may kind of chafe at my descriptions of it, but that's how I see it. Right? Is people can now issue their own, be their own identity provider again, which is self-sovereign. Right? That was the whole point of it, user-centric. The idea that we missed when we talked about user-centric was self-sovereign is slightly different than user-centric. Right? User-centric says the user is at the center. It doesn't necessarily say that the user is in control. Whereas self-sovereign implies that the user is in control, right? The person is in control. So I think that's been an important distinction. But I like that OpenID Connect community has started working on this and found ways to do credentials. I don't actually know enough of the details to do a detailed comparison between how the two systems work and where the pros and cons are, but I think that'll we'll start to see that. I expect that OpenID Connect has enough momentum behind it that we'll see a lot of activity in that space, and that we'll see credentials exchange there. My personal belief, although, like I said, I haven't done a lot of research, so this is just a belief, it's not a statement, is that DIDs and DIDCOMs provide more flexibility in terms of the protocols that you can run on top of the underlying messaging system. But those things change, right? I mean, people can author new things and change things, and so it's hard to say exactly where that's all going to go. But I think it's great because I think that the more people who are thinking about credentials, pushing credentials, thinking about this, self-issued idea, right, which is self-sovereign with a different name in some ways. I have nothing but hopes that it will all work out and we'll all benefit from it. So,
thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.